Welcome, everybody. I'm Mike Murphy, the co-director of the USC Center for the Political Future. I hope you're enjoying our Warschaw Conference on practical politics, the year of politicking dangerously. Well, if that's not scary enough for you, we're going to enter the world of politics and foreign policy, where a lot is going on in the world. We're going to look at the global challenges for Joe Biden and see where he's doing well and where he might be screwing up. We're going to have a full discussion with a tremendous panel. We're lucky to have everybody. Let me get through the introductions. We have David Kang here. David is the Maria Crutcher Professor in International Relations, Business, and East Asian Languages and Cultures at USC, with appointments in both the School of International Relations and the Marshall School of Business. He's director of the Korean Studies Institute at USC Dornsife and author of numerous books, scholarly articles, and opinion pieces. Marcos, a great journalist. You might have followed him like I do. He's had a dual life in the foreign policy world and in journalism. Marcos Kounalakis is the author, publisher, journalist, international relations scholar. He's a visiting fellow at Hoover at the Stanford University. And we are lucky we have California's second gentleman here today. He's married to our Lieutenant Governor, Eleni Kounalakis. So thank you, Marcos, for joining us. Nina Srinivasan, did I pronounce that right, Nina? I was terrified. I thought, of course I didn't. What's the correct pronunciation?
It's really easy. It's just Srinivasan.
Srinivasan. Oh, okay, that's great. Rathburn, she is a professor of international relations here at USC at Dornsife. Her research and expertise focuses on international security with a focus on multilateral nuclear proliferation and counterproliferation policies. She previously served as a foreign affairs officer for the U.S. State Department on multilateral nuclear proliferation. So we're getting to the wacky world of nuclear weapons and progress we're making or not making in the questions. And finally, my buddy, Kori Schake, great American patriot, a hero in some of the Trump wrestling within the Republican Party. She leads foreign and defense policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute. She has had a distinguished career in government, well known and respected there, working at the U.S. State Department, the U.S. Department of Defense, the National Security Council at the White House. She also served as a key foreign policy advisor for my old boss, John McCain's presidential campaign. So we got the dream team here. My job is to ask questions and keep it moving. We will have time for your questions out there. You have to go to the chat room and enter them in, and then I'll be reading them a little later in our program. So number one, and we'll do this kind of informally. I'll just throw it out and people start talking, and if it turns into a crazy cable show, I'll try to straighten that out so everybody can have their point made. We got about 15 topic areas we're going to try to go through. So be succinct, but be yourselves. First question, it's got to be Joe Biden. He became the first president in 20 years to end America's long war in Afghanistan. How will history remember Joe Biden's decision to completely withdraw troops? Could his administration have avoided the last-minute catastrophes we all saw on television? Was it done right, done wrong, inevitable, not? What's our scorecard and our insight on the end of American military participation, at least for now, in Afghanistan? And why don't I start with Kori?
Okay. I think the last 3 American presidents have wanted to end American participation in the war in Afghanistan. And the problem is nobody, including Joe Biden, could figure out how to do that without Afghanistan collapsing back to Taliban rule. President Biden, to his credit, was willing to pay that price to do it. So I don't think President Biden could have avoided the consequences of Taliban takeover of the country, but he absolutely could have avoided the consequences of panicking America's allies, abandoning America's Afghan partners, in particular, those who participated in the war effort on the coalition side. America's allies who fought alongside us these 20 years in Afghanistan it's ringing pretty hollow for them that America's back, because they tried very hard to persuade President Biden not to do this and not to do this on such a short timeline, and couldn't get any traction on their concerns.
Okay, anybody want to join on that? Disagree, agree, opine? Just speak up.
I would join Corey in that assessment, but I would also say that a lot of what remains seared in our minds is that chaos that occurred at the airport. Now we're entering into the political realm and what will remain in the minds of the electorate. And when it comes to how do we assess Afghanistan, it's not the 20 years, it's not some of these other issues of allies or our failure to communicate with them, but it really is those last few days and how people clinging to C-17s were dropping off and running onto the tarmac. And I'd say that if there were three things that the administration could have planned better for, and there's a whole list of them, but the three that I put on my list are it would have been important to figure out how to compel or entice the president of Afghanistan to have stayed in the country during its transition. I think his abandonment really just exacerbated things. Secondly, I'd say it's, we know how to control the information domain when we enter into a conflict. Clearly, we didn't know how to control the information domain exiting a conflict, and I really fault planning in this case to not be able to allow the Taliban's victory and their rolling over the country to seem inevitable and to have a bandwagoning effect as a result. And then finally, I'd say, I don't know who figured it was a good idea to trust the Turks to control the airport and to manage the airport security situation, but that was clearly a bad idea. They were already double dealing with the Taliban previously, and so that final thrust really created this horrific imagery to add to all of the systemic and endemic problems that Corey mentioned.
Yeah, it was the beginning of Biden's polling declines, but I guess there never are good optics to American troops rushing for the door. But, we're kind of it's a good transition to the next question, which is, will there be a power vacuum in Afghanistan after the withdrawal of our forces? My political analysis of it is, it was optically bad, but what would worry me if I were in the White House with Biden is that right now the Taliban has a big red button on their desk to get on the front page of the New York Times anytime they want to by acting up. And Biden, whether he ought to or won't, will own that for the next year or so. So any trouble they make, then his opponents will say, aha, we left and now it's, terrorist threats are growing, et cetera, et cetera. So what do we think the next year in Afghanistan will look like and the kind of power vacuum that'll exist? The Taliban has their own problems with the Islamic State. Let's get out our crystal balls, which are always tricky in these kind of things, and take a look at what we think the next year might bring.
May I take a swing at that one, Mike?
I'll throw it open to anybody who wants to get out a rusty. I'll bring out mine, but it'll be wrong.
I think the most important thing that will happen in Afghanistan in the next year is large-scale humanitarian crisis. This is a really serious problem. It's urgent. The United States and other governments are going to have to make the distasteful decision of whether we both legitimate and assist the success of a Taliban government in Afghanistan in order to prevent mass starvation in the country, which is, we are right on the edge of that problem. Our defenses have gotten so much better since September 11th, 2001, that I'm skeptical that even as terrorism gets purchased in Afghanistan, that it will be a major risk for the United States or for allies beyond the region. But I'd be interested in other people's views. And it seems like Mike dropped off, so jump in there, somebody.
I'm going to agree with you. I think that to a degree, you also have the issue of the kind of inevitable instability that you were going to have there. But the question of doing the humanitarian assistance is one that I hope this administration will recognize, that there is a real need there, because I honestly agree that I don't think that the terrorism concern is as strong as the humanitarian concern there.
And I would only add that if there is a terrorism concern, but it's not for the United States, it's really for India. Because if Afghanistan suddenly becomes a Pakistan who really move forward with some of its designs and creating regional tensions, then I think that can be really catastrophic.
I am back, but I apologize. I think there's something wrong with the Zoom connection here, which is odd. I do this all the time from the Zoom. Can you hear me? I can't hear you. We might want to have some, okay, wait a minute. I'm getting thumbs up. So we're going to do this. Let me throw out question number 2, even though I have to do some work technically on this end to be able to hear everything. I'll get that fixed. Let's turn to the Biden inaugural address. The president promised to rekindle diplomatic relationships with countries and to, quote, as he says about domestic policy, build back better. How successful has the Biden administration been on this front, and how different is President Biden's foreign policy philosophy from his predecessor? And let me end with a little contrarian tag on that. You know, there was all this relief, at least among Biden's.
Okay, Corey, why don't you lead this?
Okay.
I know what his question is going to be because I see it on this list.
Okay.
Okay, so until Mike comes back, I'll ask the question.
Right.
And then that means I don't have to answer it. So the question he was going to ask is, how successful has the Biden administration been on this front, and how different is President Biden's foreign policy philosophy from his predecessors?
So I think his philosophy is quite different from his immediate predecessor, and a return to the general trend of American post-1945 philosophy of advancing democracy, working through multilateral institutions, leading cooperation internationally on big problems like climate. So it's clearly a departure from President Trump. I would point out, though, that while European allies heaved an enormous sigh of relief to have President Biden in office and feel much more comfortable, America's allies in Asia, many of America's allies in Asia, were supporters of the Trump administration's policies, in particular, the much harder line he was taking on China. But I defer to David on that.
Well, I have a very unconventional view, as people often say, but thanks, Corey. It's good to see all of you. It's too bad Mike's not here. I mean, you know, the thing about East Asia that the Biden administration is running into, and I think this is presaged by the question, is this going to be building back alliances with democracies, which he says half the time? Or is he going to be trying to weave some kind of containment coalition against China, which he says the other half of the time, which includes countries like Vietnam and Singapore, which are not necessarily democracies or even allies? And it isn't clear how this is going to work. We see this in the response to the Australia-US submarine thing. Singapore came out, Indonesia, Malaysia, all came out very skeptical about it. And I think that the issues are far more complicated than simply countries in Asia are afraid of China and they want the US there. The countries in Asia have to live with China. And what they want is a US that's going to help them do that without making things worse. And right now, I'm not sure I see a very clear policy personally.
Nina, do you want to jump in this at all?
So I would say that there seems to be more willingness to work with China, at least recently. And I note both the joint statement that the United States and China made in the COP26 negotiations, as well as the upcoming bilateral meeting. And so I am a little bit more hopeful, although that US, UK, Australia deal was really poorly done. Poorly organized. And the idea that you want to have HEU for nuclear submarines in Australia versus LEU, low enriched uranium versus high enriched uranium, also I think is really problematic in that region.
So I don't think we've got Mike here. And as I said, I wasn't going to join in on that question. But and until he jumps back in, unless anyone else wants to do this, I do have his questions in front of me. So I figure I may as well just take over, unless David or Nina, you've got them there. We've got Bob. Here we go. He's going to take over.
I'm going to pinch hit, and hopefully Mike will come back at some point. So I'm not caught up with the questions yet. Why don't you ask the next one, Marcos, and then I'll be caught up.
Okay, so these do come from Mike. So I'm just going to jump in and do this in a rote fashion. As tensions between the United States and China increase, and we just touched on that, particularly as China's economic and political ambitions within the Indo-Pacific region and beyond grow, is there any way the two countries can work together on global issues like climate change? And we just touched on that a bit.
Yes, and they are.
That's right. The Joint Communique just came out. It's a start, but it's also an object lesson in how do you decouple the many issues that the United States has. And certainly appointing Secretary Kerry, with whom Bob Shrum is quite familiar, how do you separate this one complex global commons issue from the many issues that also exist between the two world's largest emitters? And I think this is a problem that's going to be ongoing. I don't know how you do it, but we're trying to deal with it in the United States as a standalone issue. I just came back from COP26, where my wife was representing the state of California. And speaking of pinch hitting, Bob, she was pinch hitting for the governor. So what was notable was the United States' presence at COP26 in Glasgow and China's absence. And I think that they were able to come up with any communique, no less a joint communique at the very end of it, is a very positive. Proof is in the thing.
So we seem to have a lot of gremlins today that are interfering with what we're doing. But do you all generally sense what Corey was saying was right, that somehow or other we are going to manage on this common ground issue of climate to find a way to cooperate with China and actually begin to get climate under control? Anybody want to take that, David?
Yeah, I mean, I would add other things besides the climate thing, which is I think the U.S. and China are beginning to work in that direction, right? But I'm a little leery about hiving off everything else that's going to be, well, that's all too complicated and competitive, and the only thing we can cooperate on is on climate or some of these global issues. Right? I mean, I think what I watch in D.C., and forgive me for calling it a blob, but is everybody now is just taken for granted China's rising ambitions and etc. What I would like to see is far less attention to a bunch of submarines that aren't going to be here for 20 years, literally, and instead a focus on China's application to join the CPTPP, whatever it's called now, right? The Trans-Pacific Partnership with the new form. I don't think they're going to get in, but it's a sign of China's ambitions for what they expect to have over the next 20 years. They are going in a direction where they expect to be able to join high-quality trade institutions. They have a very clear economic strategy for joining the world in a number of ways. And it's different now than it was even 10 years ago. I mean, we tend to think like, well, China will never do it. In fact, when they started 10 years ago or talking about this in 2013, there was, I was skeptical. There's no way China can join. And then they started mumbling about maybe trying to join. And I think we missed this at our own peril. And this is where I think the Biden administration's unwillingness to go back to regular trade pacts and to continue that part of the Trump strategy, I think, is directly harming the United States.
I agree that
Oh yeah, and other countries are going in. I'll stop. I talk too much.
No, you don't. You don't. I'm now gonna go away because Mike's got his technical glitch fixed and he appears to be back. But
So-
I may be back if he goes down again. Talk to you
I
later.
just want to jump on and reinforce David's excellent point, which is the biggest mistake Biden is making in foreign policy is expecting that we can get Asian allies and even European allies alongside us with a hard-hitting China policy if we don't have a trade and economic policy that helps them be prosperous absent deep involvement with China. You just can't get from here to there.
Excellent. I apologize for my absence. I tweeted against Putin yesterday and everything electronic now no longer works. I don't know if there's a connection or not, but I still say the that he's a stinker. Okay, I assume we're talking about Biden stumbling with the Europeans, Afghanistan, the submarine deal and all that, because I've not had the benefit of hearing. All right. I think we're going to talk a little bit more about China, unless Bob asked about tensions there. Did he? And I apologize to our listeners that I'm behind everybody on the planet with where the discussion has been. Did Bob bring up China and talk about that a little bit, or we can, because I have an outline here I'm trying to follow. Looks like he didn't, because I'm not getting aggressively told, yes, Mike, he did. Catch up. So let's talk about China a little more. And I'm going to pivot off Corey's point about if you can't have the European economic interests kind of aligned with the Chinese, it's very hard to get them to play the foreign policy game tough. What is, and I heard David talk about, and I think this was true of Afghanistan a little bit, Biden has seemed to have an appetite to kind of do Trump light on a few things, on trade and others. What should the Biden reset be? Because, I mean, here's a guy with declining poll numbers who needs to start making things happen for political success. The Chinese, at least in the Taiwan thing, have been able to start a little bit of a tsunami, so to speak, in the American press and everything. So the Chinese issue is getting hotter. We have the Olympics coming up, which is going to be very important to the PRC leadership. What moves do you think the White House should be making going forward to manage the relationship and, frankly, and manage the domestic policy of looking like maybe a little bit of a stronger leader than he has with the Afghan pullout in the stone with Europe?
So
Anybody who wants to start.
I think the biggest problem the Biden administration has is the gap between what they are claiming they're doing and what everybody's watching them actually do. So they talk about putting human rights at the center of American foreign policy, which is a beautiful thing to do and largely inconsistent with writing off the war in Afghanistan. And they haven't yet explained how they are going to square that with partnering with countries that aren't democracies. And they haven't yet explained how that's going to fit in our broader China policy. So they leaned very far forward on calling calling China's behavior genocide in their dispossession of Uyghur Chinese, and then nothing. And so I think they're really struggling to try and figure out both where do human rights actually fit in priorities when you have to make foreign policy, and second, they still don't know what they mean by a foreign policy for the middle class. It was an easy, cheap talking point that, Wall Street was the beneficiary of globalization, but that's actually not what Americans think. If you look at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs polling, for example, Americans are pro-trade by a pretty wide majority. They believe it makes them more prosperous. And so the Biden administration is sort of trapped in Joe Biden's 17 years ago doctrine and can't figure out how to make it work as policy.
If I can jump in briefly, I mean, I think that's right. And the way that I tend to characterize it is, first of all, I don't know anything about domestic politics. But what strikes me as the team he put together, at least on East Asia, is that he doesn't want to have to put any domestic capital on this, or political capital. And that he's really focused on domestic. And so we have these as Corey said, these are very traditional policy elites doing the traditional American views on things, other than the ones where he's trying to push this, again, against trade and things like that. So they say all the right things, but I don't think there's a lot of direction there. And I do think that the goal is to simply keep things from getting too out of hand, which is why you see it lurch here and there sometimes on East Asia. They say what they need to say. An example we can talk about later if you want is like North Korea, where they say they're willing to talk, but I don't see anything substantively going on. So it looks good, again, but I don't think this is where his efforts are. And I think that's why it looks a little haphazard. Not to be too critical, but it seems a little haphazard.
Well, let's talk about North Korea, because that was clearly a focal point of President Trump. He sure spent a lot of time kind of, and I know you're a subject expert there. So I'll follow up with you and the others can chime in. But President Trump had, I'll be kind, I'll call it an unorthodox approach. There was normally a lot of linkage. Without any linkage, they got a summit. I think the North Korean leadership would never have dreamed of having a quote win that big. What is the Biden policy going forward? And has there been any forward progress, or are we sliding backwards, or has it all been optics and everything is the same, and the North Koreans remain the problem they've been? And how are South Korean attitudes evolving? Because they went through the roller coaster ride with the president. Now they've got a new president. What's the new policy? What's Joe Biden going to do?
They will have a new president. The election's in the spring. But anyway.
Oh, they will. Okay, right. Sorry.
Yeah, right. I mean, I'll tell you what I think, which is there was a chance with North Korea and Trump to make a little progress. It was going to be a small deal. The Yongbyon nuclear facility for some relaxation of sanctions. And somebody went big in Hanoi, and then everybody walked away, and that's where we are. And the thing that bothered me at the time was when we were so far down the line towards thinking Yongbyon was going to be dismantled, that at the national laboratories at Livermore and Los Alamos, they were asking physicists to consider going for 3 months, because this is not an easy thing. I mean, that is a deeply irradiated, that's an environmental disaster, right? Getting rid of that by itself is a win for the whole region. And then people were saying, oh, well, it's not working anyway. That's what they're building they're using fissile material from Yongbyon right now, right? I would have taken that deal. I would have moved the ball forward a little bit. I think one of the issues for most American presidents are that they want the big deal, right? You have to say denuclearization. Frankly, I don't think North Korea is going to denuclearize. I would rather us focus on managing the issue. But I think politically that's incredibly hard to do. And that's where Biden is right now, is the way my short version.
Yeah, I've been told by North Korea experts I know that it's impossible for the regime to give up the nuclear card, because then things really would collapse. It's been the bulwark of their claim to legitimacy. And Nina, I see you kind of head moving here. I think you've got some opinions. So let's hear from you. What's your take on North and South Korea and Joe Biden, how he might navigate forward, or what you think his plans might be?
So I'm not sure what his plans are. I'm not sure he knows what his plans are, but at the same time, I agree with David on this, that there's no way North Korea is giving away its nuclear weapons. And there is still possibly some things, if not politically palatable, that we could do, right? I mean, the amount of increased missile development that North Korea is doing, I think, is really destabilizing. And the tests that it did in September and October for new missiles, I think are really a concern for South Korea, as well as less so, right, for us. And so I do think that we need to start thinking about alternatives to the old way of thinking about denuclearization as the only path forward with North Korea.
I'm going to jump in and reinforce again what
Sure.
the other two have said. In fact, a few years ago, I wrote a piece called "Nuke Deals Are for Suckers." And I wasn't just talking about the Gaddafi regime or some of the other ones that we often use to talk about giving up weapons of mass destruction. I was really thinking about Ukraine and Belarus. The minute that they give up their deterrence forces, they become much more vulnerable to a larger predatory state. And in the case of Ukraine and Belarus, of course, Russia has made good on taking advantage of their lack of nukes. They once had them. I would come up with two more things on the nuke question in North Korea. One is that I think we have to remember what happened in Hawaii in 2018, where 38 minutes, the state was terrorized because they thought there was a nuclear attack that was impending on the island. And people were rushing home, calling loved ones, saying, I love you. It was great being alive, but we're about to be obliterated because of the tensions that we were at that moment having with North Korea. I bring that up because what's important is recognizing, one, as both Nina and David say, going for total denuclearization is a pipe dream. Figuring out, however, how to manage the relationship and lower those tensions so that we don't have people running off the road in Maui and Oahu to avoid nuclear annihilation is going to be key. And so those are my points on the denuke.
It seems to me one byproduct of the situation in North Korea is that the Japanese political rhetoric has changed and they're starting to rearm a bit, which is a big, I mean, they've always kind of quietly been very pacifist, but fairly well armed. But now they seem to be moving. Is that true? Is that in America's interest? Because they're an ally? Are we worried about that? Because it just seems like the whole region is tooling up, so to speak.
I think
Anybody,
it is
Corey?
true. I think it is true that Japan is likely to soon breach the constitutional restriction on defense spending. Maybe not by proclaiming it and getting the Constitution changed, but by finding accounting ways to do it. It's partly North Korea. Remember, it's been, I think, 10 years already since North Korea fired a missile over the Sea of Japan. And that in the Koizumi administration, you started to see Japan worried that the security dynamic of Asia was changing in important ways, and Japan needed to change. But I do think it's China much more than North Korea that is driving Japan to do some really interesting and important cooperative work. For example, they are cascading Coast Guard ships and training Coast Guards in Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, to help those countries better police their own fishing rights and territorial waters, because China has grown so much more aggressive. And Japan's actually making a really smart, really interesting set of choices. They teamed up with Australia after 2010, when China cut off rare earth supplies to Japan over a fishing dispute. The Japanese funded the opening of mines in Australia, or have a secure supply chains initiative. Japan's teamed up with India to try and create an alternative investment fund to the BRI. So the Japanese, it's not just a sort of rising militarism or a narrow defense strategy. Japan is actually making really smart, really creative, strategic choices about how to improve the defenses, not just of Japan, but of potential partners in Asia as well. It's good for us.
Can I add a little bit to that? I mean, I think that's all right.
Concurrent views?
Oh,
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. The thing that I would
go ahead, David.
Oh, okay. Caution against, though, is too easily saying that there's an arms race or everybody's rearming, right? I mean, Japan has gone to $50 billion is what they're talking about now. I remember when Abe a couple of years ago was talking about rearming, and they were going to do like 16%. Even that was a pipe dream, and they get about 3%. But $50 billion compared to of Japanese defense spending versus like $250 billion for China. You know, we saw what Japan can do when it feels threatened 100 years ago, right? I mean, they are not responding as if their survival is threatened. They are responding as if they need to help manage what's going on in the region. And the countries in the region are as well. There isn't a region-wide arms race. I say this simply because I've been looking at this data. I'm finishing a book. But it's about 1.6% in East Asia of the average defense spending of these countries. It's really low, and it's lower from the Cold War. So these countries are, and as Corey said, it's piracy, it's coast guards, it's fishing, it's a lot of stuff that the countries have to manage. And yeah, maybe Australia's going to get, again, we're going to get maybe 8 submarines 2 decades from now. But the reality is these countries have not chosen to react the way that they would if they were under threat. I mean, this is an enduring theme. I mean, Trump was, it's not just Trump who's trying to get allies to spend more, but it's Europe and East Asia. These countries are not spending what we think they should. And I think in some ways we ought to ask, maybe they know better than we do. I mean, I just put that out there.
One last China question before we move on. It's a big world, a lot of topics here, and we'll get to your questions. If you add them, send them to the room, and I will read them and we will discuss. The Taiwan Strait, there was a little bit of a kerfuffle in the press where, at least in the eyes of the reporters, I think it was a poster in the New York Times, that Biden was kind of sending a firm version of that masterpiece of ambiguity that temple of ambiguity, the one China policy, well, some other signals out of the administration were a little more muted as the Chinese have been flexing some muscles in the direction of Taiwan. What do you think the Biden administration ultimate strategy will be to deal with the PRC's increasing interest in at least making rumbling noises about Taiwan? The same old stuff, the same old opera, or are there meaningful power shifts going on? Anybody? Corey, go ahead.
I think
I
President
think my
Biden,
thing broke again. Okay, there we go.
I think President Biden actually doesn't know what his Taiwan policy is, because this isn't the first time he has made a statement about the US being obligated to the defense of Taiwan, which is actually not legally true. Taiwan is not an American ally. The Senate has not ratified a treaty committing to our defense of Taiwan. So it's technically inaccurate, but it is reflective of an increasingly a deepening commitment to the people of Taiwan as it becomes an ever more vibrant democracy and as China becomes ever more threatening to it. So do I think President Biden would actually go to war over Taiwan? Oh, I really hope we don't have to answer that question. And part of not answering that question is not being so provocative that China feels like it's looking at a closing window of opportunity in Taiwan.
So here's the one time I'm going to disagree with Corey Shockey probably ever, because she's always so good. But I think that President Biden knows exactly what the policy is, and that policy is strategic ambiguity. And if ever there was ambiguity in terms of what's coming out of the White House and out of the Oval Office versus what our policies are, I think that's exactly it. Being able to say multiple things at the same time and suggest that they're all our policy is our policy. And by the way, it's being met by the Chinese as well. The PRC is also practicing its own form of strategic ambiguity. One form is something that Kurt Campbell once talked about, which is they won't answer the hotline in Beijing when we call it. It sits in a room, it rings, and no one answers it. So there's two ways of playing this game, but I think in terms of the president saying that he'll do one thing and then the administration coming in and correcting him or suggesting that we're going to do something else is exactly what the.
I'll give it perspective. I agree with both what you said. Let me give it from the sort of the Taiwan perspective or the Asia perspective. First of all, there's not going to be a war. China's not going to invade Taiwan. I mean, that discussion is ridiculous, right? That's not what's going on over there. There's a lot of signaling that's going on, but nobody's mobilizing for some kind of invasion, right? And the Taiwanese are not responding as if they were. What is going on, though, is that we are, if you compare the two real trouble spots in the region, North Korea and Taiwan, over the last 70 years, one has gotten a lot more stable than the other one. In Taiwan and China, compared to the 50s or even the 90s, you can travel more, there's investment, there's trade, there's all this stuff back and forth. And it's pretty clear that the long-term strategy for China has been not deterrence, but interdependence. We're basically going to make it a moot point over generations about whether Taiwan's independent or not. You can call yourself whatever you want, but you're going to trade so much with us that you're basically stuck. And that's so different from the Korean one, which is still basically only stable because of deterrence. And so the task is, can we keep the Taiwan issue more stable as opposed to getting less stable? And I see it going a little bit in the other direction, but I don't see the signs right now as being China plans to invade. That's a lot of signaling as other countries make other claims in the region as well. So there's way much more signaling going on than I think that than we recognize.
And he just sent me a rather quaint telegram saying, yeah, what are you guys up to with India? It looks like there's more and more of an American focus, which has traditionally been very Pakistan-centric, particularly while we were in Afghanistan, and the Pakistani regime has their own issues. But India is a growing major economic power, strategically extremely important in the region. It seems like we've been paying more and more attention there. What do we think the Biden-India strategy is, and what do we think it should be? as India tensions with the Chinese on border issues do seem to be going up as well. Who wants to? I've got a little bit shaky audio. Go ahead. So when you want to speak, if you want me, wave or scream or something, because it's hard for me to get too many signals.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to be trampling in all the time.
No, go ahead, Corey.
I think the United States has wanted a lot closer relationship and a lot more security cooperation from India than India has been willing to give it for a long time. I mean, that was the point of the Bush administration nuclear sharing or acknowledgement agreement with India, which I'd love to hear Nina's thoughts on the non-proliferation signaling of that. But the reason that there's so much more cooperation is because China's behavior is precipitating overt Indian alignment with Australia, Japan, and the United States. The quadrilateral cooperation between those four countries is broadening and deepening because those four countries are really nervous about what China's doing, and not just militarily. I think it was really smart of the Biden administration to lead their first meeting with the Quad on vaccine cooperation and distribution, to send a signal to the countries of Asia that we're not just gunning up for dealing with China. We have creative, agile strategies that are going to address the actual problems Asian countries are worried about, as David said.
So
Anybody else? Go ahead, Nina.
The nuclear deal. So, 15 years ago when it was signed, I was really worried about what the impact would be on nuclear nonproliferation by that deal. And I thought it was really not in the United States' interest to recognize the nuclear power of India. But I think that what we've seen is that it hasn't had nearly as negative an impact on the nuclear nonproliferation deal as we thought it might. There have been so many other stresses to nuclear nonproliferation that the US, India, the NSG, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, recognizing and allowing for sharing of technology with India, the 123 agreement for civil nuclear relations with the United States and India, all of that has not actually created as much instability for the regime as potentially all of the modernization of nuclear weapons that are going on by the nuclear weapon states. And then I also think that in terms of the stronger relationship with India, it's really important, especially when you have to look at climate change, that the need for sustainable development and the United States playing a major role in terms of technology and investment in India, that is so key. And I mean, I might be not a usual supporter, but I think nuclear has a place in this world, right? It may not be what most of the people in the climate change want to hear, but there's a role for nuclear energy that I think that we should emphasize more.
So on India,
I couldn't agree more on that. It's good politics if Biden does it right too. It ought to be infrastructure too. But go ahead, Marcos.
Yeah, on India, if the Biden administration isn't trying to make them have a special relationship, the way we've argued that we've got a special relationship with England all these years, I would argue within their halls that they better figure out how to make it a special relationship, because it is the key to how we balance going forward in the future. I'd say that he's got two problems that are immediate. One is in a post-Afghan world, how do we, the states, deal with Pakistan, and what is the relationship we have with Pakistan? It is going to be determinative of how closely we can build that friendship and relationship with India. And secondarily, he has a domestic problem. As Corey said earlier, pursuing a domestic agenda that is a foreign policy that also focuses on human rights and on diplomacy makes it very difficult within his own Democratic Party to build that special relationship with India. There are an awful lot of progressive forces within the Democratic Party that don't necessarily want to see that.
That's a very good point. Okay, so we're having like a case story in cyber warfare, because I refuse to believe it's my computer here. Let's talk about cyber. The new kind of evil soft power is screwing around with other people's elections. And we, of course, had that experience here. Do we think we're going to see more of that? My personal view as President Trump was far too soft, kitten swipes at the Putin regime for what they did, direct attack, in my view, on our democracy. Will Biden be tougher? What's Biden doing? And what ought he do if we see more and more of this election interference, which on a global basis is totally growing? There's absolutely no doubt it's become a weapon of subterfuge in foreign policy by some regimes. What do we think?
So I think the Biden administration is doing better than the Trump administration. And I'm especially impressed by the way they are handling it with the Russians. So they privately asked the Russians to arrest and hand over, and they provided the information justifying it. Some Russians associated with organized cyber attacks on the United States. And they're pushing back on a lot of these fronts to try and make cyber less the Wild West, to demonstrate that we have the ability to attribute attacks and a willingness to treat this as a law enforcement problem, even internationally, which strikes me as a really smart approach to it.
And as we pursue this, we have to recognize that the cyber wars that we've been fighting up until now are not going to be the same wars that we're fighting next week. The technology continues to evolve, and the ways to counter the measures that are coming from our adversaries are going to be much more complex. And just as an example, they're going to come from areas where we haven't yet really dealt with it. One being, for example, cryptocurrencies and fintech. How do these new technologies, which have not yet matured to the degree that they will rapidly, affect the United States standing when the dollar has been the reserve currency of the world? I think that there are multiple areas which we're not yet familiar with within the technological frame that are deployable both by nation states and by others who are non-nation state actors.
That's a great point. And anybody else on this? Because I'm going to go to the always terrifying topic of nukes.
So
Nina, go ahead.
I actually want to say that most of the really troubling aspects of election interference, especially from Russia, are really not a new technology. It's not cyber warfare, it's misinformation, right? And it's destabilizing of democracy by encouraging the spreading of distrust and the spreading of disagreements and political divisiveness that Russia has gotten involved in for a really long time, longer than my lifetime, right? And so I don't know that it's cyber. Cyber is a whole different issue in terms of where it's really a concern. But in terms of elections, the issue is information. And then in terms of the issue of cryptocurrency, cryptocurrency has mostly the value of not being traceable. And that is really problematic when you combine that with organized crime and particularly cybercrime.
Which gives treasuries all over the world an enormous incentive to start forcing regulation in that realm.
Right.
And I hope we're going to see that regulation, right?
Our libertarians, they go, oh, it'll be a stateless currency. And I go, yeah, let's see how that works out, because every state agrees on one thing: no stateless currencies. All the enforcement tools go away, and taxation tools and other things they care a lot about. But crypto is going to be huge going forward. All right, nukes. So it's been interesting for probably forever, but I've noticed there have been it's kind of been a boom industry in Washington for the last 2 decades, nuclear reviews. The Schlesinger one, Obama did one, Biden's in the middle of one, and they tend to come back and say, these things are all like 8-track recorders, they're old, we need a lot of money to modernize.
It's been pretty consistent of investment and increasing investment in both developing new weapons, particularly the potential of having low nuke weapons, right, which are really problematic in terms of proliferation because of the concern that they might actually be used. But when you look at the need to actually start producing plutonium again, right? We haven't produced plutonium since 1989. And I mean, I know that it's an old issue to talk about the dead and moribund fissile material cutoff treaty that never came about, but we really lose a lot when we start modernizing and really investing in new kinds of uses for nuclear weapons.
So I think nuclear policy is the best place to remind people that it's actually Congress that runs defense budgets and policy in the United States, not the president. And in order for President Obama to get the votes in the Senate to ratify New START, he had to commit to a program of modernization that Republicans and even Democrats on the Armed Services Committees are going to force to conclusion because they made a bargain. The second thing that I think argues for continuity is that the China report that the Pentagon just released and suggestive that China has changed its nuclear strategy from a minimum deterrent to something much more ambitious by dramatically increasing the size of its own nuclear force, is not going to push us towards greater nuclear restraint or a break in the bargain about modernization. And the third thing is, President Biden and his national security advisor would very much like to change America's declaratory nuclear policy. That is, to go from saying, the ultimate deterrent of war against the United States is our recourse to winning it by using nuclear weapons, to something that says their sole purpose or that we will only use them against nuclear armed states. And the problem with that is extended deterrence. Secretary Austin went to the NATO defense ministers meeting, and every single NATO ally objects to the US changing its nuclear policy because they fear it will encourage conventional attacks on them. And so I think coming after President Biden's debacle in Afghanistan, it's going to be hard to push forward with a change to declaratory nuclear policy that makes all of our NATO allies anxious and unhappy.
And I would add to that.
Can I actually push you a little bit, Corey, on especially China and the degree to which China's vast increasing of its nuclear stockpile that it's announced and planned, and how much that is in relation to missile defense in the United States, and thinking about this in somewhat traditional arms control and arms races terms. And so I think that it's particularly important to remember that when we think about and as we were just talking about, the India-China relationship is, and the degree to which China responding to the United States and really increasing its nuclear stockpile then creates real concerns for India. And so I just wanted to see what you thought about that kind of traditional way of looking at the interaction between China and the United States.
Oh, I think that's a really good point, Nina, and one I shouldn't have overlooked. And there's more corroborating data on your side of the argument, which is China's conventional hypersonics, the test from a couple of weeks ago to demonstrate that they could get through US missile defenses even with conventional means. So yes, I do think there's that our investment in missile defenses, as pointless and expensive as that undertaking appears to be, given that you can simply overwhelm any defense of that kind, and given how provocative an attack on American territory would be, conventional or nuclear, you're right, they're connected.
What I was going to just jump in with is that we're just dealing with also a new form of deterrence policy, because we have two new domains that haven't yet been tested in terms of the escalation ladder. One is the cyber component we discussed a bit, but also space. When you have missiles that can go up, ASATs that can go up and take out satellites, or when you can do the types of things that are disruptive to a great degree, to what degree, with an attack of that sort, if it is deemed an attack, when does the nuclear component jump in? And I don't think we have that cross-domain deterrence strategy.
I have to put on my moderator hat and give a big thank you to Corey, who has to leave us a little bit early to go save the Constitution. Corey, thank you very much for joining us. And home,
It was such a
if you
pleasure,
have
and I appreciated the chance to learn from you guys.
5 years from now, we're going to have more nuclear warheads or less. We used to have 12,000. Now we're down to 1,500. Good slope, but all you need is one to have trouble. What do you think, Nina? I'll start with you.
I
You're
don't think that the question is how many nuclear weapons we have, right? I don't think that that's the most important question. I think it's what kinds of nuclear weapons we have and what we intend to use them for. And so I think that Marcus's question about whether we're thinking about nuclear moving into space, even if it's just in a satellite area, that's much more concerning than the actual number of nuclear weapons, because how many times do we actually have to be able to destroy the world?
Well, let me tag you with one question. This idea of low yield nuclears, which seem to me to also be more usable nuclears, which begins an escalation ladder, maybe more than you want it to. Is that being seriously considered? Do you think it'll happen? They'll show up in the arsenal or not?
So I do think that they're going to show up in the arsenal. I think that we are putting a lot of money into developing them, and we have been for more than 15 years. So I do think that we're going to have low yield nuclear weapons, and I do think that that is very destabilizing.
Okay. David, Marcos, anybody else on this?
I second Nina's argument. Yes, it is very destabilizing. Yes, they are coming. And yes, there will be new challenges to our deterrence policy that is not what we think it is today. You know, we've lived in this world that has oddly remained peaceful as a result of deterrence, but when you escape the framework of that deterrent policy, which is, you know, major nations with nuclear weapons, and you enter into new domains for conflict, I think we're really going to be struggling to figure out how to maintain the type of peace we've had and the type of stability that we've experienced, even with these weapons.
Oops, sorry, Dave, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that I actually think that to some degree, the missile technology is much more important to look at than whether or not it's a nuclear tipped weapon. And so I think that the real technological advancements and the spreading substantially farther than nuclear weapons of missile technology is much more an issue that we need to look at.
And I'll just, I'll come back in as the area specialist, right? I truly don't understand the discourse over China. I truly don't understand. We have, 1,500 deployed nuclear weapons and like 5,000 total. And China for 50 years or so, over that, has had a minimum deterrent of 150, 200 warheads. They say they might go to 400, which will still be 25% of what we do, and we're all losing our minds and ripping our hair out. I mean, I don't think they're the proliferation issue. What's that?
The number I heard was 1,000, Dave. So am I just wrong about that? Because when you go from, I agree, 400, yeah, it's not that much different. 1,000, now you're beginning to get in a similar realm. And I'm still going to point out it's India more so that's going to get worse than the United States.
That's what I mean, right? This is what I mean. Yes, the numbers may be going up, but I don't think they're the proliferation issue. I simply don't see how that's happening, right? That will justify us doubling or something else, but.
So let's say President Biden called up, great panel, tell Murphy to get off AOL, but and said, all right, what steps to make a meaningful legacy impact on increasing global stability, which is always the goal, and it's so elusive and so difficult. What could an American president do that's not being discussed? This is time for the oddball ideas, the interesting contrarian view. What advice would you give the president? Because right now he's kind of got a generic foreign. I'm not Trump. I'm going to kind of manage China, but I'm afraid to trade. There's no real distinctive Biden foreign policy agenda yet. If he really wanted to hit big, is there a strategy you ought to consider? Is there things not being talked about? This is kind of the wide open closing question here. And love to hear from you guys. Who wants to start? Marcos?
Sure, I'm willing to go, and since you want me to swing for the fences, I'm going to start with. I would suggest I'm sitting in the Oval Office and I'm looking him in the eye and I'm saying, Mr. President, we've got 17 missionaries who are held hostage in Haiti right now. They're being held by a gang of crazies who are holding them for ransom in a country where we've just a country that's in our region where the leadership was killed, and refugees are trying to enter the United States. Get in there, get the refugees, destroy the gang. Do it tomorrow if you can. Get those contingency plans ready. I think I'm cutting out, so I'll come back again with more ideas if you want.
I'm sorry, I crashed again, but I came back to hear the end. Who's next? Nina, it's all yours. Save the world.
I'm going to actually jump off what Marcos was saying, but I'm going to take it from a completely different perspective. Rather than really trying to get those gangs as the major kind of fundamentally changing Biden administration plan, I would say it's sustainable development. Really get in there with a ton of money and really change the dynamics on the ground so that we don't have the numbers of asylum seekers. We don't have the numbers of people fleeing their countries. If you want stability, you have to do it in terms of development. And so I think that that's really what we need to be talking about.
Well, I won't say what I would do if I were king, right? But, from a Biden perspective, what I think...
No, here, go for it.
Well, I think that the threats from East Asia are far overhyped. I absolutely do. We're running around convincing ourselves of a China threat. We just take that for granted. And the reality is the countries in the region, as I said, are not spending because they're not planning to fight a war. The solution to East Asian stability is not going to be military. And we always lead with our chin. Phone ops operations, and the army now wants to put stuff out there, and that is absolutely not going to be the solution. The solution is diplomatic and economic in the region. When people in the region wake up, when leaders and elites and people in the region wake up, they're not worried about invasion from China. They're worried about immigration, piracy, fishing, and these issues. And if the U.S. really wants to do something about East Asia, we need a strategy that's going to address those, and it's not going to be the military.
So well said. Go ahead, Marcos.
I can jump in and finish up my thoughts if you like, or we can go to Bob.
Sure, let's do it. Let's do it, and then I'll throw it to Bob, who's going to set us up for the next panel.
Great. So, after you clean stuff up and create a Grenada type of event in Haiti and try and build that regime up, I think it would be indicative also of the region we need to pay much more attention to. And that region is our backyard, Latin America, the Caribbean basin. We have to recognize that while we had our unipolar moment at the beginning of this millennium, the great powers are challenging us regionally, and that we have to recognize that we don't have the type of power projection that we once had in these areas. So what should we do? Focus on home, of course, the home front, but also the home front in terms of what is important to us strategically in our own neighborhood. And then finally, I would say, Mr. President, a lot of the people that you've known, that you've built relationships with for so many years, are now at the end of their careers. Angela Merkel is basically now a caretaker. Some of the other leadership that you've known for all these years and you've had a great relationship are on their way out. It's time to prepare your vice president to get out in the world, take advantage of her youth and her experiences, and maybe even of her ethnicity. If India is really going to be the most important relationship we have to develop in the next few years, figure out how to use Kamala Harris, who comes from Indian extraction, to deploy her in this area and really use her to build that relationship up.
Okay, I'm going to take over because of Mike's technical glitch. I have a final question for all of you, or the three of you, and because I'm political, it's political. Elections in this country are seldom about foreign policy, unless you have a Vietnam War, unless you have a 9/11. How much do all of these complex challenges that Biden faces, how much impact will they have on 2022 and 2024? And we can just go around the horn. David?
I agree. I don't think very much at all. Right? I mean, of the region I know, even China might be a sort of an elite issue, but I don't see this being a major motivating issue among regular voters. Right. So I think this is very marginal.
So I'm actually going to say that I think that there is one area where it really does hit home, and that is on our southern border, which again is getting to the issue of destabilization in different regions and the degree to which people are fleeing and really trying to come not only to the United States, but to Europe. And I think that that really can, and I think we've seen it, has in the past really affect domestic elections.
And I'd say that in fact, foreign policy has been the main driver of the presidential elections. You know, Barack Obama voted against, was opposed to the Iraq war and our intervention in the Middle East. Donald Trump said he was going to get us out of Afghanistan. And in fact, Joe Biden too promised that he was going to get us out of Afghanistan. He was the only one to do it. And so I would agree with Nina on the border issue, that this is also a foreign policy issue, that one that is going to be key. It helped Donald Trump win his election by promising a wall and keeping immigrants out. It's going to remain an issue going into 2024. And I think the thing that we don't know yet, the crisis that hasn't yet occurred, is going to be determinative, and be assured that something will happen come 2024.
Okay, I want to thank our panelists, Dave, Nina, Marcos, and our valiant moderator, Mike Murphy, who never has these kinds of technical problems when he's on MSNBC. And I'm sure if he was on the 11th hour, they wouldn't know quite what to do. But I want to thank all of you. I want to thank our audience. We'll be back in about 7 or 8 minutes with our final panel. So thank you all, and thanks to the audience.